Hello, everybody out there. This is Coffee with Bobby. I am Pastor Bobby Wilson from First United Methodist Church in Borger, Texas. And we do this 3 times a week, where Mondays we talk about one of the Psalms because, well, we read the Psalms, but a lot of times we don't really dig down deep into what they mean and what they are. Then we're looking at Wednesdays, we're looking at the parables, because the parables, man, they are so interesting. Jesus does so many different things in the parables and the Gospels. And then Fridays are my choice, which means I get to choose what we talk about, just whatever is interesting to me at the time. And this Friday, today, I'm going to talk about the Third Commandment and the 10 Commandments. The Third Commandment, which is, not to take the Lord's name in vain. And we're going to kind of look at that. And I've been inspired to talk about that by a podcast I was listening to recently from the Bible Project. They were doing an interview with a scholar, the Dr. Carmen Joy Imes was her name. Carmen Joy Imes. And she wrote her PhD dissertation on this commandment, and she was going in and talking about it. And I was really enthralled with it. So the inspiration came from there. But one of the big reasons I want to talk about it is a lot of times I think we get this wrong. It's really one of the most misunderstood of the 10 Commandments. We when we come to it, we think it's talking about one thing, and because that's been our frame of reference on how we've heard it interpreted. But I'm going to suggest some things that I think it really has a broader interpretation than what we typically put to it. But I'm going to read this commandment really fast. I'm going to read it from not the Gospel, the Old Testament book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. It says this is the first list of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are actually listed twice in the Old Testament, once in Exodus chapter 20 and then again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Old Testament. But I'm going to read it from Exodus chapter 20, and this is verse 7 of the 10 Commandments. And it says, "Do not use the Lord's name as if it were of no significance. The Lord won't forgive anyone who uses his name that way." Some of the other Bible translators say do not use the Lord's name in vain, which vain is a way of something. If something is in vain or something is vanity, it's another way of saying the little or no significance. We get that from the book of Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books. Maybe I'll talk about that for a few Fridays coming up. I don't know. We'll see. But all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, you hear vanity, vanity, or nothingness, nothingness, worthless, worthless. Basically, the idea of don't take the Lord's name in vain. That word with vain means don't do it in such a way that it's meaningless. Is what the word vain or vanity or hevel in the Old Testament Hebrew, hevel means. That this is coming from the Common English Bible. I just read it. I'm going to read it again. Do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. The Lord won't forgive anyone who uses his name in that way. Now, what I'd like to do first is talk about how this is normally interpreted. It's normally interpreted in terms of speech. And we tell people, and we've already been taught since we were way little kids in Sunday school and with our parents and all that kind of stuff, to not use the Lord's name in vain. To be able to follow this commandment means that don't say that word that you often sometimes say after it when somebody cuts you off in traffic or when you get upset, or don't use it in a false pretense in a way to make an oath with someone that you then go back on. Don't say, "Oh," and I'm not going to say it now because I do think that's right. It's one good part of this commandment is to not say things in that way, to not say the Lord's name in that way. But the funny thing is about this is when we look at it, and when you look at it in the Hebrew, this commandment has nothing about speech. There's nothing in it about saying the Lord's name. And we'll get to what the actual Hebrew, when you translate it, a more direct translation, what that means, we'll get there later. But I want to ask you a question. Have you ever noticed that when it comes to the teachings of Jesus, or the Old Testament commandments, the 10 Commandments, or the other different laws of the Old Testament, or anything along that line, we have a tendency to want to ask this question. Okay, what am I not supposed to do? What am I not supposed to do? See, we want to narrow it down and narrow down the scope of either Jesus' teachings or whatever it may be, so we know what we have to avoid. What do we not do so that we are good? What do we not do so that we can follow this? Tell me what I don't have to do. But the problem with that concept is the Christian faith and the Jewish faith, neither of them are gospels or religions, faith systems based on avoiding sin. That's not we don't have as Christians, we don't have a gospel of sin avoidance, and the Jewish people didn't either. The laws that the Jews followed from the Old Testament, or that still follow from the Old Testament, are a sign of God's grace to them, showing them how God desires them to live so that God is in relationship with them, and they're reciprocating of that, of following the laws, show that their desire to be in a relationship with God. God gave them the law, God gave them the Ten Commandments, and God gave them the Levitical laws and Deuteronomical laws as a way of showing, I desire to be in relationship with you. This is one way I'm showing you that my desire is I'm showing you what I want you to do. In other cultures that surrounded the Jewish people, that surrounded the nation of Israel at the time of the Old Testament, at the time when the Jewish laws were given to the people, there was this belief among those other people that their gods, their deities, would punish them. And the other people would have to go around and figure out what was it that they did wrong? What was it that they did against the will of their God, against their deity, that made that deity punish them? And they had to try to figure it out because their deities didn't tell them. Their deities were distant. Their deities didn't really want to be in a relationship with them. But if they ticked off their deity, if they ticked off their gods, then that god or those gods would punish them. Where we see with the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament is not like that. The God of the Old Testament says, I desire to be in a relationship with you, you nation of Israel. I came after you. I rescued you. I'm claiming you. And that's a big part of the Ten Commandments is God's coming to the Israelites, say, I'm claiming you. I'm claiming you as my people. And here's what I desire of you. Because I want to be in a relationship with you, so I'm going to let you know what I desire of you. I'm not like these other gods that these other people worship. I am different. I love you, and this is how I'm showing you how to live. And the same is true with Jesus Christ. We don't have a gospel of sin avoidance. We don't have a gospel that is about not doing the bad things. We have a gospel that is about following the desires, the will, and the purposes of our God. And we see as Christians that revealed in Jesus Christ. Our gospel, it's a gospel about the good news that is calling us to reconciliation with God, to relationship with God. And that it's giving us a new way to live. It's not telling us what to avoid, but it's telling us how to live so that our lives may be transformed into that new way of life. And that's what we see in these Ten Commandments. And that's one thing we see in the Third Commandment, to not use the Lord's name in vain, or to not use it in a way that makes it worthless. Now, I talked all of that about not being a gospel of sin avoidance and not narrowing it down to just what we don't have to do, but how to live, to say this. The third commandment here in the Bible, third of the Ten Commandments, to not use the Lord's name in such a way that it carries dishonor to God. See, the Hebrew word in it, the Hebrew word that we often translate as to not use it, or to not speak the Lord's name in vain, it doesn't mean speak, it doesn't mean to use. What that word is, it's the Hebrew word called nasa. It's kind of like the word NASA, but it's nasa. And the more direct translation of that word is to lift up, or to take up, or to carry. To lift up, to take up, or to carry. So your best translation of that is what it's saying is, do not lift up the Lord's name in vain, or do not lift up the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. Do not take up the Lord's name as if it were of no significance, or do not carry the Lord's name as if it were of no significance. Now, this is kind of confusing to us because words are essentially speech, and we don't lift up God. We don't take up God. We don't carry God, not in a literal sense. So what could it mean? What does it mean to not lift up, not take up, or not carry the Lord's name in vain? Well, what our biblical scholar Carmen Joy Imes says, and I absolutely agree with her. What she says is this, and I'm going to read it because this is straight from her. It says, to not carry or lift up or take the Lord's name in the name of God in vain means not misrepresent him through our lives. To not misrepresent him through our lives. And what she says is we're called to carry or to lift up the name of God wherever we go. Now, this doesn't mean that we're called to go around and say, God is so wonderful to everybody we meet. But it's to live your life in such a way that it represents who God is. Don't live your life in a way because, the people who lived around the Jewish folks and the nation of Israel, they would know that these folks were Jewish. And so if you lifted up God's name or lifted up God, but through being his chosen people in a way that misrepresented him, people would look down upon your God. They'd look down upon you and upon your God because you would not be representing God in the way God desires to be represented, in the way God deserves to be represented. So that leads us to the question of what are some ways that we can misrepresent God? What are some ways that we today can misrepresent God? You and me. What are some ways that all of us, and particularly those who call themselves Christian, because you got to look in the context of the Ten Commandments, they're coming after God claimed the nation of Israel. The Ten Commandments were for the nation of Israel. They weren't for the other groups around them. They were for anybody who claimed God, Yahweh, as their God. So today, the same is true for Christians and non-Christians. The Ten Commandments are not a law given to non-Christians. They're given to Christians. Those are people of faith. So what are some ways that we can misrepresent God? Well, we got to look at what is God calling us to do. God calls us to feed the poor, to care for the poor, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to give the thirsty water, to live in such a way that shows compassion, shows love, that shows the compassion and love God has given for us, and then God is calling us to represent him by the way that we then take that compassion and love and grace and mercy that he's given us and share it with others. Some other ways we can misrepresent God are by not trusting him first, by trusting other things. It could be money. That's a big issue here in the United States and in the Western world is we put a lot of faith in our checking accounts. We put a lot of faith in our ability to earn income. When God is saying, put trust in me first. If you follow my wills, if you follow and do what I am asking of you, I will take care of you. But we often pay lip service to that promise of God and trust more in our bank accounts, our IRAs, and different things. We do the same thing with politicians. I know folks who are Christian who on their social media posts, probably at least 10 to 1 are posts about politics as opposed to God. And the posts that I see about politics are not positive. They're usually posts that are very partisan in nature, that are denigrating or degrading or meant to attack the party of which they're not a part of or not affiliated with. And that is a way of misrepresenting God when our social media posts, our conversations are filled much more with politics and politicians and the nastiness that just seems to inevitably come with that, as opposed to how we represent God through those things. And yes, we do represent God through our social media, through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and everything else. There's lots of other ways to misrepresent God. When we have racist tendencies, or we don't defend folks who are in the face of racism. That's a way of misrepresenting God, because God is clearly against racism, clearly against anything that separates community and breaks down community. There's lots of other ways. I'm not going to go into it because we're already at about 16 minutes here, and I don't want to take up a lot more of your time. But I just thought it was really interesting that this commandment, the third commandment, is not so much about speech, although we could easily misrepresent God with the way that we speak and the way, if we say those things, if we take the Lord's name in vain, as is commonly interpreted, that definitely misrepresents God. But it's a much greater than that. Misrepresenting God we can do it in every aspect of our lives. And so we have to be aware of how each action that we take, every social media post that we share, every word that we say, represents God. And it represents God in a positive light or a negative light. Well, God bless you all. Next, on Monday, we are going to be going back to the Psalms. I don't know which Psalm yet. I haven't decided. I've been reading a few different ones, but I'm looking forward to that. God bless you all. Hope you have a great weekend. Our online worship service with First United Methodist Church starts at 10:40. You can find it on our website, which is www.fumcborger.org. You can find it on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube page. I'm looking forward to getting to worship with you. The sermon this week is on doubt. It's on doubt. The title is, Can a Good Christian Have Doubts? And that's what we're going to discuss. Are doubts bad? Can doubts be bad? Can doubts be good? Who knows? We're going to talk about it. God bless you all. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend.